Welcome to Alpha and Omega from the Flood to the Future, a full class number 6 of Divine Architecture.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. If you are tuning in right now, I know exactly why you're here. You are insanely curious. You want to understand the world, you want to explore multiple perspectives, and you want to do it without feeling completely buried under an avalanche of information overload. You're looking for the insights, the aha moments, and the broader context. And that is exactly what we are setting out to provide today.
Yeah, we are taking a really fascinating look at how comprehensive worldviews are constructed. Specifically, we're going to examine the intersection where ancient texts meet modern science and how certain frameworks attempt to basically synthesize the two.
Right, and our source material today is a text titled Alpha and Omega, a defense of biblical foundations. There's a really detailed study focusing heavily on the first 11 chapters of Genesis.
Yeah.
And just to give you the full picture of where this is coming from, this text is part of a larger body of work by the same author. It's closely connected to a couple of other books titled Bite-Sized Prophecy and What is a Christian to Believe About Creation and the Flood.
Exactly. And the mission of today's deep dive is to explore how the author builds what theologians and philosophers call an apologia.
An apologia, right?
Right. Essentially, an apologia is a reasoned, systematic defense of a specific position. So today, we're going to examine how this author defends the concept of a literal six-day creation. What's totally unique here is the methodology. The author takes ancient biblical scriptures and layers them directly over modern concepts in quantum physics, thermodynamics, and cosmology.
Which is a bold approach.
Yeah.
Now, before we go any further, we really need to state something incredibly important.
Yes, definitely.
Our goal today is absolutely not to endorse these viewpoints. We aren't here to debate their scientific validity, and we certainly aren't here to take a side in what is often a very politically and culturally charged conversation.
Right.
Our job is simply to be your impartial guides. We are going to unpack these arguments exactly as they are laid out in the source material so that you, the listener, can clearly understand the ideas, the logic, and the specific worldview contained within this text.
That is a crucial distinction. We are looking at the architecture of the argument. How does this text connect point A to point B? Because by understanding the structure of that argument, you gain this really valuable insight into a prominent framework for how millions of people reconcile their faith with modern scientific discovery.
Okay, let's unpack this. The text starts by going all the way down to the absolute microscopic level, the fundamental nature of matter itself.
Down to the building blocks.
Exactly. The author points us to the book of Hebrews, which was written roughly 2,000 years ago. Specifically, they highlight Hebrews chapter 11, verse 3. The verse essentially states that the visible world was made out of things which are invisible.
And this is where the text makes its first major bridge between scripture and science. The argument presented is that this 2,000-year-old verse perfectly anticipates modern atomic theory.
Which is wild.
It is, because today, physics tells us that everything we can see, touch, and interact with is constructed from microscopic particles that are completely invisible to the naked eye. We're talking about atoms and even the smaller building blocks.
Protons, neutrons, electrons.
Yes, and subatomic particles like quarks and neutrinos.
Which is pretty mind-blowing to think about when you consider the historical context. I mean, as the text points out, the ancient writers living in the first century didn't exactly have high-powered electron microscopes sitting around in their tents.
No, not at all.
They had no technological way to observe subatomic particles.
And setting up that historical contrast is the foundational pillar of the author's entire Apologia. The argument is that because the visible world is indeed formed from the invisible, just as modern science now confirms, the Bible actually predates and predicts scientific discovery.
It sets a precedent.
Exactly. Establishing that premise early on is vital for this framework because it sets the stage for the claim that Scripture isn't just a collection of spiritual allegories, but a text with profound scientific accuracy.
Right. And if someone accepts that premise, that the ancient text anticipated the atom, they're naturally going to be more open to following the author into the next big topic, which is thermodynamics.
Oh, yeah, the heavy physics.
Exactly. This is where the source material gets heavily into the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Let's look at how it handles the first law of thermodynamics, which is the law of conservation of matter and energy.
To put the first law simply, matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. They can only change forms.
Right.
The text uses a great everyday example to illustrate this. When you drive a car, the engine burns liquid gasoline. The actual matter that makes up that gasoline isn't destroyed when it burns. It is simply converted from a liquid state into an exhaust gas and heat energy.
So the total amount of matter and energy in the universe remains absolutely constant. And the way the author ties this universally accepted law of physics back to the Bible is fascinating. They draw a direct line to the very first chapters of Genesis, specifically Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, which is the passage where God completes his work on the seventh day and rests.
Yeah, and the author's argument here revolves around a specific theological concept called bara ex nihilo, which is Latin for creation out of nothing.
Out of nothing.
Right. According to the interpretation laid out in the text, once the 6 days of creation were finished, that specific supernatural process of creating new matter out of nothing completely stopped.
So in this framework, God resting on the seventh day essentially means the universe hit its matter and energy quota.
Yeah, exactly.
No new material has been brought into existence since that exact moment.
That is the core claim. The text argues that Genesis 2 perfectly anticipates the first law of thermodynamics, because the biblical narrative shows no evidence of new matter being brought into existence after that initial week. It aligns with the modern scientific observation that matter is conserved, not continuously created.
To back this up, the source material draws a really interesting linguistic distinction that I think we should highlight. It's about the difference between two Hebrew words used in Genesis.
This is a great point.
First, there is the word bara, which means to create entirely from nothing. Then there is the word asa, which means to make or to form something out of existing materials.
And that linguistic distinction is heavily utilized in the author's defense. For example, the text points to the creation of humanity in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. It notes that man was not created ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Instead, man was formed using the word asa from the dust of the ground.
So the material was already there.
Yes, it was simply reorganized.
It's basically the ultimate recycling program, which totally mirrors that first law of thermodynamics model the author is building. The text then pulls in verses from other books, like Nehemiah, to affirm that the matter of the universe is actively preserved and conserved.
But then it pivots.
It does. The argument pivots to the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy. And this is where the worldview presented in the text takes a very sharp turn away from mainstream scientific consensus.
What's fascinating here is how the text positions the concept of entropy. For a quick refresher, the second law of thermodynamics states that in a closed system, as time moves forward, things move from a state of order to a state of disorder.
They break down.
Right. Think about a hot cup of coffee left on a table. It cools down and dissipates its heat. A clean room eventually gets messy, things decay, they break down, and the available usable energy in the universe is constantly decreasing.
And the author takes this observable law of decay and places it in direct, head-to-head opposition with the Big Bang theory and evolutionary biology.
According to the text, the mainstream narrative of the Big Bang suggests an explosion that somehow led to increasing complexity, order, and biological evolution over billions of years. The author asserts that this narrative fundamentally contradicts the second law of thermodynamics.
Because things are supposed to be decaying, not getting more complex.
Exactly. The argument is that since closed systems naturally move toward disorder and decay, an undirected explosion could not logically result in the highly ordered, complex universe we see today.
To support the idea that the universe is in a state of decay, the text pulls in several specific scriptures. It cites Psalm 102 and Isaiah 51, both of which describe the heavens and the earth wearing out like a garment.
Yeah.
It also references Matthew 24, where it says, "Heaven and earth will pass away." The author's point is that both ancient scripture and the modern law of entropy are in complete agreement. The universe is winding down, not building itself up into greater complexity.
And this brings us back to the author's core thesis. The 20th century physics were anticipated by ancient writers, and if those ancient writers knew things they couldn't possibly have discovered on their own, the text argues this points to a divine source.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We move from thermodynamics into the concept of fine-tuning and something called the anthropic principle. But before the text drops the wild mathematical probabilities on us, it makes a point to define its terms. It specifically separates its argument from what philosophers call a God of the gaps argument.
Which is important. A God of the gaps argument is a logical fallacy where someone uses a supernatural explanation for something simply because science hasn't found the natural explanation yet.
Like ancient civilizations believing lightning was thrown by a literal god.
Right, because they had no understanding of atmospheric static discharge. As science fills in the gaps in our knowledge, the need for that God shrinks. The author wants to make it very clear they are avoiding this fallacy. They aren't pointing to something we don't understand. They're pointing to what we do understand about natural laws, arguing that the laws themselves imply a lawgiver.
So instead of a god of the gaps, the text leans heavily on teleological arguments. These are arguments based on the observable, incredibly precise design of the universe, which brings us to the anthropic principle, or fine-tuning. This is the idea that the universal constants of physics are balanced on an absolute razor's edge, specifically to support human life.
The author frames this by referencing Psalm 19, verse 1, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God," and then dives into a list of cosmic constants that astronomers and physicists have identified. The premise is that these parameters are so precisely tuned that even a microscopic fraction of a change in any one of them would make life completely impossible.
Let's run through some of these constants from the text, and let's actually break down what they mean, because it really paints a picture of how delicate the universe is, according to this Apologia. First up is gravitational coupling. Gravity is what pulls matter together to form stars and planets.
The text points out that if this gravitational coupling were even slightly larger, stars would be too massive. They would burn through their fuel too quickly and erratically to support life on any orbiting planets.
But if it were smaller?
If the coupling were slightly smaller, the pressure inside those stars would never be great enough to fuse heavy elements, which are absolutely necessary for life.
That incredibly tight balance with gravity actually leads right into what's happening inside the stars themselves, which is governed by the strong nuclear force.
Yeah.
To put it simply, protons in an atom have a positive charge, and positive charges repel each other. The strong nuclear force is the incredibly powerful glue that holds the nucleus of an atom together despite that repulsion.
And the margin for error here is microscopic. The text argues that if the strong nuclear force were slightly larger, hydrogen wouldn't exist. It would all fuse into heavier elements.
Wow.
But if it were slightly smaller, hydrogen would be the only element in the universe. There would be no carbon, no oxygen, and therefore no life.
Then you have the weak nuclear force, which controls radioactive decay. The text states that if it's larger, the universe produces too many heavy elements. If it's smaller, it doesn't produce enough. And what about electromagnetic coupling? This is the force that binds electrons to atoms.
If the electromagnetic coupling varies in either direction, larger or smaller, chemical bonding simply doesn't happen. Molecules couldn't form. Life is entirely dependent on complex chemical bonds.
There's also the ratio of protons to electrons. The text points out that if that ratio is altered at all, electromagnetism would dominate gravity to such an extent that star formation would be completely prevented. But maybe the most mind-bending constant listed in the text is the expansion rate of the universe.
This is a staggering number. The author points out that the expansion rate of the universe must be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the 55th power.
10 to the 55th, that's huge.
Yeah. To understand the consequence, if the universe expanded slightly faster, matter would fly apart too quickly, and galaxies could never coalesce. If it expanded slightly slower, the gravitational pull would cause the entire universe to collapse back in on itself shortly after it began.
To really help you visualize how tight that margin of error is, the text uses this incredible analogy. Imagine a tape measure or a ruler stretched across the entire observable expanse of the universe. If you were to move the measurement on that cosmic ruler by just a single inch, the expansion rate would be thrown off, and we would not exist. It is a cosmic balancing act.
And the text doesn't just stay out in deep space. It brings this fine-tuning argument right down to our local neighborhood, the Sun-Earth-Moon system. The author claims there are over 30 specific local constants that must be exactly as they are for us to survive. It's far more complex than just finding a planet with liquid water.
Right. The text argues that life requires an incredibly fragile web of environmental interdependencies. Take Earth's surface gravity, for instance. If our gravity were stronger, our atmosphere would be too thick and would retain toxic gases like ammonia and methane. If it were weaker, our atmosphere would be too thin and we would lose all our water into space.
The author also highlights our exact distance from the sun. A little farther away, the Earth gets too cool and the entire water cycle freezes. A little closer, it gets too warm and the water cycle boils away into a massive greenhouse effect.
Even the tilt of the Earth is brought up. We have an axial tilt of exactly 23.4 degrees. The text argues that if that tilt were any greater or any lesser, the temperature differences across the surface of the planet would be too extreme to support our ecosystems.
The physical movement of the Earth is also fine-tuned according to this worldview. We rotate at about 1,000 miles per hour and orbit the sun at roughly 67,000 miles per hour. The text points out that if we rotated much slower, the temperature swings between day and night would be lethal. If we rotated faster, the atmospheric wind velocities would be catastrophic.
The author keeps stacking these local constants. We have a magnetic field that protects us. If it were any weaker, lethal stellar radiation would sterilize the planet. Even the thickness of the Earth's crust is mentioned. If the crust were thicker, it would absorb too much of our atmospheric oxygen. If it were thinner, volcanic and tectonic activity would be too rampant for life to establish itself.
By stacking all of these cosmic physics and local planetary conditions, the author is building a case for staggering improbability. The goal is to show that the statistical chance of all these factors aligning perfectly by random chance is practically zero.
And it is really difficult for the human brain to comprehend the math involved here. So the text sets a baseline to help us. First, it estimates that there are approximately 10 to the 23rd power stars in the universe. To visualize that, it's roughly equivalent to the number of grains of sand on every single beach on Earth. Then, consider the number of individual atoms in the entire universe, which is estimated at 10 to the 70th power.
Against that baseline of massive numbers, the text drops this statistic. If the gravitational force alone were altered by 10 to the 36%, our sun simply would not exist.
The author uses this wild dart analogy that really stuck with me to explain this probability. Imagine blindfolding yourself, being spun around 10 times, and then throwing a dart from outer space to hit a bullseye on Earth. But the bullseye isn't the size of a dartboard. It's the exact size of a single atom.
Wow.
That is the level of precision the text is claiming is required for a life-sustaining universe.
The text also brings in voices from the scientific community to bolster this point. It quotes John Polkingworne, a highly respected quantum physicist, who noted that the margin of error in the early picoseconds of the universe was roughly equivalent to hitting a 1-inch bullseye from 18 billion light-years away.
Then the text brings up Oxford professor Roger Penrose. He calculated the chance of the universe's initial low-entropy state being created at random. The number he came up with is 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123.
Yeah, that number is insane.
To put that into perspective, the text points out that this number is so large, if you were to write a 0 on every single subatomic particle in the entire known universe, you would run out of particles before you finish writing the number.
It is precisely these overwhelming numbers that lead the author to quote a book title by Christian apologists Frank Turek and Norman Geisler, "I don't have enough faith to be an atheist." For the author of our source text, this astronomical improbability is viewed as undeniable proof of an intelligent creator. The argument is that God went to these extreme mathematical lengths to balance the universe on a razor's edge, circling back to their citation of Psalm 19, that the expanse is clearly declaring the work of his hands.
So what does this all mean? How does this deep dive into modern cosmology, thermodynamics, and atomic theory loop back to defending a literal 6-day creation account in Genesis?
The author synthesizes this by bringing all these scientific and probabilistic arguments back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. The text references the 19th century philosopher Herbert Spencer, who categorized all of knowable physical reality into 5 distinct components: time, force, action, space, and matter.
Let's break down how the text maps those 5 categories perfectly onto the very first verse of Genesis. It goes like this. In the beginning, which represents time. God, which represents force. Created, which is the action. The heavens, which is space. And the earth, which is matter.
From that foundational verse, the text briefly outlines the sequence of the first 3 days of creation. Day 1 involves the creation of that material baseline space, time, and matter, followed by the creation of light and its separation from darkness.
Then day 2 involves the separation of the waters and the creation of the expanse, or heaven, between the waters above and the waters below. And day 3 brings the separation of dry land from the seas and the creation of fruit-bearing trees and plants. But the text urges the reader to focus not just on what was created, but on the crucial mechanism of how it happened.
That is the linchpin of the Apologia. The text places immense weight on the recurring biblical phrase, "Then God said." The author argues that this phrase indicates divine fiat. In theological terms, a fiat is an instantaneous command. It wasn't a suggestion, and the author firmly argues it was not the initiation of a slow biological process spanning millions of years.
The text is very explicit about this point. He spoke, and it stood fast. According to this worldview, because the universe is so finely tuned and because matter cannot spontaneously generate or order itself, the only logical conclusion is that creation happened exactly as commanded, instantaneously, without any lengthy evolutionary process required.
Which brings the entire argument full circle. By asserting that the Bible anticipated atomic theory and the laws of thermodynamics, and by pointing to the extreme fine-tuning of the universe as evidence of deliberate design, the authors built a logical framework. Within this framework, the instantaneous divine fiat of a literal six-day creation is presented not as a myth, but as a scientifically and rationally defensible position.
So bringing this all back to you, the listener, why does understanding this specific breakdown matter? Why spend time unpacking these arguments? Especially if your own technical expertise, scientific understanding, or personal beliefs might differ entirely.
Right.
It matters because whether you are studying theology, history, science, or simply human belief systems, you are going to encounter this worldview. Understanding how proponents of biblical foundationalism synthesize ancient scripture with concepts like quantum physics and entropy gives you a much deeper, more nuanced view of modern creationist arguments.
It absolutely equips you to navigate complex conversations about faith and science. By going through this, you aren't just hearing the final conclusions, you are seeing the math, understanding the analogies, and examining the specific scriptural interpretations that build the foundation of this entire perspective.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, diving into these sources raises a really important, provocative question to mull over. The author's entire argument relies heavily on the idea that the physical laws we observe today, like the rigid conservation of matter and the constant march of entropy, have been constant since the end of that initial creation week.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this raises an important question. The source material belongs to a series that explicitly mentions the flood in its title. If the biblical timeline includes a global, earth-shattering cataclysm, like a worldwide flood, an event that would fundamentally reshape the geology and atmosphere of the entire planet, how might the author, or even you as the listener, imagine the laws of physics operating before or during that event?
Yeah, that's a huge point.
Did the fine-tuning of the universe briefly shift to allow for such a massive cataclysm, or was the potential for that event built directly into those original constants from day one? It is a fascinating question of how constant those cosmic constants really are within this specific theological framework.
It is definitely something to chew on as you explore these ideas further. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration has given you some new insights and helped you understand the intricate ways people piece together ancient texts and modern science to build their worldview. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out multiple perspectives, and stay curious. To leave you with one final thought directly from the source text, the author concludes their prologue by echoing the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, stating, "Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation." This represents the ultimate, urgent message the author hopes to convey through all of the physics, math, and apologia we discussed today. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to the full Masterclass number 6 of Divine Architecture. Also available on your favorite audio app, search for Alpha and Omega from the Flood to the Future for on the go.